First order of business, center school reuse study. Just kind of set the stage. Recall we've had a number of goes at this. Some years ago there was a proposal to sell the former center school. Town meeting decided that was not the course they chose. We came back with a proposal to use it for municipal purposes. Town meeting chose not to do that. We came back and town meeting said try and lease it. We tried that option, had one responsive bidder who subsequently backed out because of cost, and they needed to expand. The facility wasn't quite large enough for their needs. So we were fortunate enough to get a grant to take another look, get an outside objective look, professional look at what are the potential options and what might be the facility costs associated with preparing the building for the recommended uses. And today we have not a decision brief, but a presentation on kind of where things stand, and have a group here ready to make a presentation. Linda, do you want to introduce your group?
Yeah. John Wilkes is not here. Bob Bartlett is not here. Betty Parada is on the committee. Stanley Szymanski, Buster, and myself. We also have Jen Mozick, who is from Pioneer Valley Planning, that comes to our meetings. And we've had several meetings up to this point. We had a meeting with the consultants to go over the report that they presented to us. We talked about the condition of the building, what the options were, what the town of Hatfield is like. And we are an aging community. We're not shrinking, we're growing. We talked about whether the school needed extra space, the town hall needed extra space. We talked about the library, which they chose not to come in because they're looking for an addition on their building. We talked about housing. We talked about what was not good for the building across the street. The building is in good shape for its age, but there are things that are starting to happen that need to be addressed, or it's going to get worse. We talked about what some business people, whether they wanted to buy the building or they would be interested in buying with the town owning the building and having a building and land lease. There are some issues there with load-bearing walls, so dividing the building up, I guess, would be a problem, but I'm sure, with architects today, almost anything's possible. So one of the things was that we all seem to not want to sell the building. We would like to be able to keep it if we could. So they are interviewing, the firm is interviewing different people in town to see what they were looking for. And that's just about it, unless you have something to add.
Would you like to introduce your consultant group?
It's AJ. Okay. I don't have his last name written down. Don Hafner from HAI, the firm that we we hired or suggested that you go into contract with, and this is Maura Cochran. So I will let him take over and tell you what we found and go over the report with you.
I'm Don Hafner from HA Architecture, and presenting with us today is Jeannot Bly, Patrick Dominov, and Maura Cochran from Bartram & Cochran. We've prepared a progress report for you, and we're going to leave Paul with some copies of the report that he can distribute amongst the committee or the selectmen. Today, what we're going to do is cover with you the extent to which we have progressed on the study, We're going to start by telling you a little bit about the building and site evaluation, which is the first part of the study, and then we're going to have Mara come up and recap some of the marketing and economic development issues that we have pursued as the project has gone on.
Great. Okay.
Need to take a mic?
Want to kill that light so we can see the slide? Hello? Well, probably need some light here for John. John, do you need light?
No, I can see the screen.
Put the light on the back.
Okay.
Is
Yeah.
there more like that?
Hi, good morning. Janelle Bly from HAI Architecture. I believe we're going to have maybe about an hour a presentation, if that's
Fine.
okay. I'm going to spend about 10-15 minutes and go through the condition of the building itself as it exists, and then Maura will go through the marketing analysis. We're about 2.5 months into the process of this project, and we have about 3 months to go. So we wanted to get input on directing the final phase of our work so that we could really focus the solutions on specific potential uses for the building that would be acceptable to the committee and the town and the Board of Selectmen, so that the work could be as productive in actually developing a solution that will finally make the building a viable economic source for the town. The building is 100 years old this year. It was built in 1914. It's Jacobean revival architecture. It's a beautiful building. Architecturally, it's really a jewel for the town. It's a very valuable asset, and it's something that probably is unlikely to ever be replaced. But we're at the tipping point now where, even though the building was solidly built and it's in fairly good condition, it's deteriorating in many aspects, and it's beyond the point of maintenance or minor repairs that can cope with the deterioration. And there's a significant investment that needs to be made in order to really preserve the building and prevent it from deteriorating further. It's been vacant since it was the Western Mass Regional Library 10 years ago, the fall of 2004, and there's been really very little upkeep for the building, and it's actually unheated, and it's fairly cold, especially this winter. It was. The site's been covered since the beginning of our project with a good amount of snow and ice pack, and we're finally able to get a good look at the property. And this is a work in progress. This is a draft update of our report. We expect it to continue to be refined. I'll start to run through the. As you know, there are playing fields in the back used by the school. There's a field hockey field, and then the rec department, the rec committee has a baseball field for Little League. You have a earthwork around the sides of the property with the river, and it kind of tapers off on the north side of the property for flood control. Beginning with the building envelope, the roof system itself is original slate tiles, and many of them, as you can see, are cracked or broken. There's been various repairs done over time. There's been repairs done to flashing. You can see in a lot of areas that a lot of the flashing has pulled apart or is actually missing entirely. And when you're in the attic, you can actually see light through many areas through the roof. The original nails that are holding the tiles in place are likely copper. They have a 50-year lifespan. We're at 100 years now. The tiles themselves, they thin over time until they become too brittle to be repaired. And again, we're at 100 years for many of those tiles. And the thinness at its current state is at a critical point, so that our recommendation would be that the roof has to be replaced. And everything has to be reflashed with all of the building elements of the gables and the cupolas and the vents and all that, the hips and the rafters. There are 2 dormers on the east side of the building. Again, those would have to be, there is a slate on the sides of the dormers and on the roof that all needs to be replaced. The wood throughout the building, where we still have original wood windows, are very solid. They do need to all be refinished, stripped down, and repainted. The dormers, most of the glass is broken, and there's plywood in the windows so that the light is not getting into the attic space. The gable parapets themselves, there's a lot of open joints and temporary repairs that have been done over time. There's some deterioration of some of the capstones, and it has gotten into the masonry walls below the capstones. So we would recommend, again, that those all be removed, reflashed, and reset. The overhang throughout the building, there are sections of it that are still okay, but then you see that there's other areas where there's actually boards missing. There's rot in certain areas in the valley areas. There's no gutter system or downspouts on the building. Everything just falls off the building and actually creates a water issue at the basement. The chimneys need to be repointed as well, and there's been, as you see, attempts at repair work with the flashing, but all the flashing needs to be redone along with the roof. The capstones are concrete, and there are significant cracks. Some of the minor cracks have been repaired over time, but there's still some major cracks through the center of each capstone. The cupola itself, there's an active pigeon population, as you can see. If you go inside the cupola, there's a significant amount of fecal matter from a long period of time, as well as dead carcasses from the birds. So what's that?
The less active pigeons.
Yeah. Again, some of the wood is very solid, and we believe the cupola can be saved. Ideally, it would be removed with a crane, restored, and then put back on the building. The masonry, you see that under a lot of the sills, there's a significant amount of water issue there. Some repointing has been done over time in different areas of the building, but some of the mortar that was used was not appropriate to the brick type or the hardness of the existing mortar, and has actually created some other issues as well. You can see cracks in the brick near the base of the foundation. It has a brick foundation wall. And as there's no rain strip around the building, there's a significant amount of water that gets onto the sides of the base of the walls. Limestone accents, you see that there is a significant amount of deterioration for some of the pieces. And especially where there's water coming down from the roof that is getting onto the walls, that has created some of the pieces to deteriorate. Windows on the west side facing here, mostly original windows, double-hung windows, some fixed on the projected sections of the building. The windows really just need to be refinished and repainted. They're fairly solid from the original. Some of the windows on there, or most of the windows on the east side of the building have the original frames that are still in place, but they have 20 to 30-year-old aluminum replacement sashes that would need to be replaced. The entrance doors are fully rotted on the building. We even had difficulty getting into the building or using the side door. The doors at the basement level on the back are all rotted out. There are some original windows on the basement level, though, that can be restored. There are the aluminum storefronts at the stair exits on either end, on the north and south ends of the building, that are in good condition. On the windows on the east side, and there's 25 to 30 foot long strips of metal that have been placed over whatever the existing construction was that is rusting and needs to be removed to see what the condition was underneath that was trying to be covered up, to see what other additional repair work needs to be done. And then there's a shed building on the east side that would need to be removed, most likely in most development options. In the attic, it's an unheated, unfinished space, which has a significant amount of structure, making it unusable for any occupancy. And there has been, at some point, probably in the 50 to 60 year range, some steel reinforcement that was added to tie in the exterior walls. But there's still not the proper connections for current code uses for seismic or other reinforcement of the rafters. The interior of the building, it still retains much of the original construction. It has the main nearly 12-foot wide corridor running the full length of the building on this side, on the west side, and then 4 classrooms running consecutively down the hallway with a stair at either end. And both the second and third, the first and second floors are the same layout. Much of the original wood flooring, the plaster, the wood trim, and the chalkboards are still all in place, although some of the rooms have carpeting that have been laid over the wood floors. Much of the wood flooring is savable but needs to be refinished. There's a bit of damage in some of the plaster ceilings and walls on the east side. It's not extensive throughout. You can see the terracotta block behind where some of the chalkboards have been removed. That the terracotta is the wall construction within the building. These are the hallways that are between the classrooms that were used for coats. Structure, it's a wood frame structure within the building. There's a steel beam with 2x8 floor construction, and the exterior masonry wall is load bearing to the roof. These are all of the alterations that would be necessary, triggered by renovation of the building for to meet structural code.
Can I ask one quick question? You mentioned the seismic in the attic. What about, what seismic zone are we in?
There needs to be a soil boring test done in order to determine the specific seismic class that we would be required.
Because I thought you'd need something in the basement as well on the foundation. Oh, never mind. That's all right. Go ahead.
As far as mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, basically overall nothing that's in the building is reusable. It doesn't meet, it's beyond its life expectancy now. None of it meets ADA requirements as far as plumbing or energy code requirements. The ventilation system, you see there's plywood infills on the east side of the building where air was brought into the ventilation system. Those are all blocked in now. There were shafts going up the building to a gravity ventilator into the cupola, which is no longer functional. The only means of ventilating the building now are opening the windows. It's a steam piping system to a boiler, oil tanks in the basement. There's 4 oil tanks. Recommendation would be most likely to convert to gas, as there's gas lines in the street, though it's not connected currently to the building itself. There are standpipes for fire protection in the corridors, but no sprinkler system in the building. The electrical is a 200 amp, 3-phase service. With the likely addition of an elevator and air conditioning to the building, we would need to upgrade the electrical service to 400 amps. As far as hazardous materials, there is everything you see here in the basement is asbestos around the whole boiler, around all the piping throughout the building. So remediation would be necessary for asbestos, for lead paint that's throughout the basement that's chipping pretty badly. You can see there, especially because of the water issue on the west side of the building due to a lack of drainage around the basement. And also there is in the original basement, there were locker rooms with vinyl asbestos tile. Those are the main elements of remediation. There's potentially an oil tank under the slab, an original oil tank, in addition to the 4 that are to be seen now. We just did some quick estimates on abatement, about $15,000 for the tiles, $32,000 for the insulation, the pipe insulation, the asbestos, and then lead paint, about $73,000. But I'll get into more of the estimate in a minute. As far as undeveloped land, we have the open space in the back of the property. The town would like to preserve as much of that as possible in different scenarios. Obviously, it's more attractive to develop that in different scenarios for a developer, either for expanded parking or for additions to the building. The field hockey is used more so than the baseball field. They're looking currently, I believe, to relocate the baseball field anyway. There's pedestrian access to the river down the access road on the right side of the building. And then there's walkways along the river, and there's vehicle access going toward the south. As far as zoning, these are just a few of the highlights of what is allowed and what isn't. There's, as far as residential, 1 and 2 family residences are allowed within the town center district, a TC designation for the property currently. Other uses such as multifamily dwellings, townhouses would require a special permit and site plan approval, as would assisted living and convalescent home. Community facilities, child care centers are allowed, adult care center is not currently, and special permit would be required for for-profit hospital or medical facility, charitable medical facility or private clubs, and public or private schools, recreational, government, municipal, and library would be allowed by site plan review. Agricultural uses are allowed. Large-scale retail is not allowed, fast food, hotel, motel, and then office spaces greater than 15,000 square feet, professional, medical, and business offices, without a change in the zoning. Less than 15,000, it is allowed by special permit. And wholesale transportation, manufacturing, processing, warehousing, storage generally are not allowed except for printing. And mixed uses just require a special permit. And I'll have Patrick go through these scenarios that you're about to see, show the kind of the maximum extent of different uses based on the zoning requirements for footprint and for parking. They're not intended to show design, just to show the impact of the size on the property.
So like Janelle said, it's just showing about what's on the site, and if we were to add things, what would that affect, whether it's the baseball field, the parking, or the field hockey field. So this is just showing the existing site and the, what's on it, the existing parking lot that's behind it, the baseball field, and the field hockey field, as well as the access road. So we looked at if we were just to work within the boundaries of the building and the existing parking lot and reorganizing the parking lot, how much parking we could fit in the site, and I believe it's around 37 units, which could be used for, if the building was just to be renovated for housing, given the zoning, which we'll get into later, and as well as maybe some minor commercial project uses in the building. Another scenario was to, if the building was to be converted completely to professional offices or commercial spaces, what would that affect on the site and the parking requirements. So using the amount of parking per in your zoning, it's 250 square feet for one space of building. So you need about 80 parking spots if the whole building was to be commercial. So that's just showing an area of how much space that would take up on the site, and it would affect the baseball field, whether it's removed or just relocated within the site. Another scenario was to look at if the building was going to be completely community spaces, if the town wanted to do something with that. The zoning requirements is 200 square, or one space per 200 square feet of building. And then coming up with different additions, whether if it was looking at kind of maximizing the building area, if you wanted to increase commercial size on the site and how much parking that would take up, as well as doing the same area with community and showing how much parking would vastly take over the site. One we'll get into later, one of the developers asked about working with the building, but he would need an additional acre of the site for parking and other, as well as a buffer space to the public playing fields. So this was just that scenario showing, which I believe more we'll get into later. This was looking at apartment units, and we'll talk about in the marketing section of the presentation about the minimum amount of that developers would like to do for mass housing is about 40 units is the low end. So we wanted to show how much new building space that would take up and how much parking would be necessary for both. This is also using the center school as for 8 units of housing in there. So we can still maintain the field hockey field on the site with that scenario. And then this was looking at how to, if we wanted to maximize housing on the site, looking at the zoning requirements. You could take up, use about 15% of the footprint for building of the area of the site. So we were able to get a total of 63 units on the site with using the building, which is the normal number that developers would like to use when doing mass housing. This is another scenario about maximizing commercial and the parking required for that, and maximizing community, same scenario. This, we talked about if we were to demo the building, what we could do for that. So this is the maximum of our apartment units if we were to demo the building, and getting about 65 units with this way, and then the parking that is required for that. And if we were to demo the building and just use a commercial building in the center of town, the max size that could be with the parking required for that, as well as if a new community building was to be put in its place.
I'll just wrap up by going through the improvements to the site infrastructure. The parking, the condition of the pavement itself it's really should be considered a failed system at this point. It's beyond just patching. So the parking would need to be repaved. You can see the walkways are a combination of concrete slabs that are cracked and some bituminous asphalt pavement. Curb cut, site structure, landscaping. We're hoping to get a better site now that the snow is melted and really do a thorough review of the retaining walls and the side stairs around the property. Necessary improvement to utilities. We discussed the natural gas connection to the building, upgrading the electrical. Currently, there's a sub-pole on this side of the street, on the other side, I'm sorry, because the main lines are on this side, that connect overhead to the building. Given the historic nature of the building, it may be considered an improvement to trench across underground. This is the condition of the existing electrical panels in the basement. There is no electrical room set aside currently. Okay, the accessibility modifications, the If this entrance continues to be the main entrance to the building, it would need to be accessible, so there would be a ramp from parking, accessible parking probably on the north or south side. And this stair has no landing at the top, so the whole stair would have to be pulled out and rebuilt to accommodate landing, both for egress as well as for accessibility. Most likely, elevator would be on the back side of the building, which would require a vestibule and a separate entrance that would allow you to connect all the floors of the building. Just running through quickly, these are a lot of the elements that we reviewed in the building envelope as issues, and we started to develop preliminary costs of what it would take to make initial repairs. We've listed for the building envelope about $875,000. And some of this cost is dependent on the type of use that the building is going to get and how much is considered bringing the building up to a point of stability. For example, you could just do the building envelope and the structure to stabilize the building and prevent its deterioration. And a lot of the interior mechanical plumbing could be part of the fit-out of the building. So there's a bit of overlap. The hazardous materials, this is just the cost for the lead paint. There's about $47,000 additional from the list that we saw earlier in asbestos pipe insulation and vinyl asbestos tiles. Preliminary costs for site infrastructure, utilities, accessibility, demolition. When you add it all up together, we're looking at probably something close to $4 million. But again, some of that is actually creating new mechanical systems within the building, creating new plumbing, new interior finishes. So I'll hand it over to Maura.
On that cheerful note.
You can either right or left click or just use the mouse circle there.
Good morning. Several years ago, I was doing a SWAT team analysis down in Maryland, and we, about 5 volunteers come in from a national organization, and we're looking at what to do with the other side of the Aberdeen training facility. And we're coming up with all of these analyses like we always do when we're a consultant. We had one developer on the team, and he just shook his head and said, "You're getting it all wrong. The market is going to determine what is going to happen to the property. We don't care whatever analyses you do." Now, I was away for a better part of a month, and we met right before I left. And at that point, my plug number for rehabbing the building was about $1.5 million. I came back, and the HAI team had been hard at work, and they informed me now that the value of the new construction was $3.8 million. That makes a big difference when you're trying to do a pro forma. If you're trying to build a new building, a new office building, and it's going to be A quality, A+ quality, you're probably looking at about $180 a foot. This building now is $194 a foot, and that doesn't include tricking it out for tenant improvements, whether they're office, residential, or what have you. So this is going to be a major hurdle that you're going to have to face. And I have a lot of slides, but I only have a few minutes, and I want to sort of cut to the chase so you can have a good, healthy debate. Our methodology is we started off looking at demographics. You know your demographics, but coming in new, you have to look at them. And it came up that you are a stable community, slight growth, rural in nature. All of this you know, but it makes a difference when you're trying to decide, because some communities are not fast growth, they're deteriorating. Some are very young communities and they have need for a certain type of housing or infrastructure. Yours is an aging population, even by comparison to your market area, that we determined to be within about 20 minutes of here. So our demographics aren't just based on the Hatfield town lines. We did them for 5, 10, and 20 minutes because you are part of a bigger community. And drive time lets you look at where mountains are, where rivers are, how you can cross in. So if you just do them in concentric circles, you get a totally wrong read. We then started interviewing as many people as we could. We interviewed, and we got a great list from the committee. It's in the report. We interviewed citizens, we interviewed realtors, we interviewed developers, we interviewed as many people from state agencies as we could. And when you then did an overlay, and that I probably can get to, going backwards?
Right.
Left click going forward. Okay. Okay, that's your market area. Very briefly, UB here, goes up to the state line, covers a little bit of Holyoke. We looked at public, private sector uses, daycare, you name it. And here are the alternatives that we need to discuss. Under office, economic impact was high. One of the things that Buster and the others were saying, show us where the jobs are. The problem is the economics, even before I got the $3.8 million price tag, is that Northampton has a very strong office market. And you actually, right by 91, could have a strong office market. It's just not 3 miles inland. It's just in Northampton, rents are in the mid-20s. Great news, because that means that you can buy a building, rehab it, and the market rents will support it. Here in town as opposed to by the highway, your rents are half of that. So no one can look at the numbers and make it work for office. Now, you could get lucky and find some, I'll take the name of, a small insurance company may say, we want a signature building. That may happen, but it may not happen in our lifetime. So you really can't feasibly say office is going to be happening just because of the economics. And for office, you're considered a suburb of Northampton. So that's your reality. And everyone kind of laughs, like, no, again, that would be by the highway. You have one. That building is not conducive to being an inn, just the way the whole thing is set up. Then we went into public sector use, and the sort of one of my punchlines here is, because this building, if you choose to really want to keep it, is going to require so much money, you really are going to have to figure out some way of getting federal or state funds, assuming that your municipal funds are not going to be put to this use. The only use that came up was the town library. And I know it's been on the list, and I know it's been discarded as, no, we want to build, but that's your community's decision. If you think that in 2 years, when they're going to be coming up next in queue for the state funding for libraries, another thing that is going to be important as we evolve through this together is that there were certain amounts, like there was $74,000 for environmental. Our performers right now show that being on the developer. In talking with Pioneer Valley Economic Development and with the state agencies, there may be the ability of getting some things that are on the you-gotta-do punch list that could get some funds. So any developer coming in is going to be saying, how much of this burden do I have to bear? If the HAI team thinks it's $74,000 to remediate, a developer's going to put in $100,000. They're just going to look at the numbers and bump them up. And it's going to make negotiations more difficult. So when we get into, and I'll wrap up quickly because I know you want to get into Q&A, we looked at one developer, and I was telling Paul, if you like the idea of it just being the building, being converted into 12, 13 units, give him an acre and back, he said he'd take the building for $1. You'd have to sell it to him. And he would take it as is with environmental. Now, he hasn't seen this report, but it goes back to what will the market bear? If there are, in fact, developers out there that would take it under those conditions, then mazel tov, let's go for it. Most of the developers needed at least 40 units to make it doable. So when I came back and Jeannot gave me the bad news, I was like, there's an old saying, If you torture numbers enough, they'll admit to anything. So I was doing performers at the yin-yang yesterday going, okay, interest rate 6.75. Okay, this is what the developer wants for a return. And with his $3.8 million, it still made it difficult to make the 40 units work. That's not to say that a developer wouldn't make it work, because they really loaded up the $3.8 million. And a lot of that $3.8 million would be going into the rehab of a building. So that included a new mechanical system. So I still had to add money on top for doing the TI. The two things we looked at, building remains vacant. You have put in a nominal amount into maintenance. What did you come up with, $1,000 a year?
A year.
That's being put in. I mean,
Heat and insurance,
heat and insurance.
or electricity and
Not
insurance,
heat.
excuse me.
Yeah, we, with Paul's input, came up with, if you're going to keep it, you need to budget at least $25,000 a year just to keep it mothballed, just so it doesn't fall down on you. Then we said, what happens if you demolish the building? What's the worst that could happen? You take it down, and you don't have something crumbling, and you can then be opportunistic. You get a park out of it. My recommendation, since that's what you're looking to have us do, would be to have Paul and others look and see how much state, federal money would be available to stabilize the building just before you put it on the market. Know what your design criteria are. Developers hate uncertainty. They don't take bad news, but they hate uncertainty. They don't want to come in saying, oh, the town will allow me to do 40 units when you're only going to give them permits for 12. They just get turned off very, very quickly. We're also recommending that you do an RFQ, request for qualifications, before you do an RFP. So when you have a package that will say, we, the town of Hatfield, are looking to do this with X, we are willing to do 40 units. This is the acreage you'll have. This is the process that you're going to follow. A developer can then work within those parameters. Under the RFQ, they'll come back and say, we are a nonprofit that's going to be helping vets, or we are a for-profit and we're thinking of young professionals. They'll come back not with a full pro forma, but then you can judge through their qualifications and references whether they're the team you want. You'll get a higher response because people don't have to spend $10,000 doing a response. You can look at the quals and then kind of prioritize and take it from there. So to recap from my side, the first is I would look again at the library. It's the only public sector, and you may be able to save the building using other people's money. Second, the only thing that worked was putting in a minimum of 40 units and go through the RFQ, RFP process. The good part about doing that is that you will start to get revenues. And I think I put in here what the revenues are. Here somewhere. Well, they're in the full report. But you start getting tax revenues. You're in for zero right now. And even though you might have to do some tax increment financing where instead of getting $300,000, you get $150,000 to help the developer along, that's money that you have in your pockets that you don't have now. So on that note, I was told I had 12 minutes, and I really raced through because you had to spend time on your foundations. But I'll be glad to take any questions. Don, do you want to wrap up this?
Yes. So one of the things that I want you to understand is the projection that we put in for stabilizing the building and doing some of the basic building development costs. That potential $3.8 million, as it relates to the money that would take to develop an entire building project there. So, for example, if we were looking to let a developer develop the building and create a project, and it was going to be roughly $11 million in order to develop a project like that, the $3.8 million is not in addition to that $11 million. there would be a determination that would need to be made by the town as to how much of the stabilization you want to proceed with and how much you want to turn over to the developer. So the entire building project, to do something like that, just developing the building, if we just take a look at costs of, say, $175 to $185 a square foot to do a project like that, that's the way that those numbers relate to one another.
There's one example that's probably towards the end. Can you pull that up, Chanel, the Kansas City project? I think all of us found one case study. I know Buster pulled it up in his machine. That's the demographics. Keep going. Here it is. This was a project that was done in Kansas City. And when you look at the enlargement of the building, it's in your package, it is almost identical. It has an auditorium to it, but it shows how they, in fact, did some additions to the back, and it had some nice floor plans. So other people have done this, but you'll notice they usually have fairly large. This is Mead, which I think your town would be interested in doing. But that was just an example of some of the others that have done a project.
And there are projects that we can see in our area as well that are similar to this. There are some old school buildings in Northampton that have been rehabbed for this purpose that I'm sure people know of. So there is a similar potential for development. The one thing that we'd like to stress again is that the building is deteriorating, and we believe that you do need to do something to stabilize the building. The content of the report, if you read it in detail, really speaks to the state to which the building is degenerating, and in a very short period of time you'll have a complete report from us. But we're hoping that we will get some sort of feedback from the town as a whole, obviously not today necessarily, but what your interpretation of the findings so far is, and if there's anything else that you can impart to us to help guide us to finish the report.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I should have asked this at the beginning. I intended to and slipped by, but what's the intended outcome of today's session, other than informing us of kind of where you are? Are you looking for specific direction? One of the things we said when we started down this path is we all have opinions, but our intent was to hold back and look for a recommendation from some outside folks who are objective and professional. And so we're not trying to steer a decision, or a recommendation, rather.
The window of opportunity is narrowing, and we knew this at the point where, Mara was wrapping up her first phase of the work, that there were not so many different options that were really viable to you. And, we want to make sure that, the town understands that this process is really sort of steering what may be left to you to develop. And so we really want to let you know that there are simply a few options that are available to you. And as a town, you have place some restrictions, some theoretical restrictions on the development of the property. There has been from the get-go this recommendation that the playing fields not be touched, that there is a sanctity to the building that needs to be maintained in order to sort of maintain the civic intent of the tightest portion of the downtown, the common. And, we're trying to be respectful of that as we go forward and propose these things to you. But it's getting to the point where some feedback, even in the most general sense, would be helpful to us.
Well, it's obvious trades are required. I mean, a number of these considerations were taken in a vacuum, and yes, we'd love to have it fixed up, and yes, we'd like to retain ownership, and yes, we don't want to spend any money on it. I mean, it doesn't all come together. My takeaway, what you're saying is really housing is probably the best potential.
It is and it isn't. If, in fact...
Other than you mentioned the library. However, remember, the library grant is premised on a specific design and building that has been approved. It's not an independent grant just to go build a library.
Okay. But in looking forward to your response, if the library is not an option, we'll just take it out of the report. I mean, you can get back to us and just say, please, just take the library out. It's not going to be happening there. So at that point, we'll just say, okay, we don't have, when we go to the public hearing, public meeting, we're not opening up the can of worms of should it be the library or not. If that's not an option, fine. That's the only public sector need we identify that would potentially allow you to get state funds. So then if you go, well, that's off the table, then you'll say, well, what are the only options that we have for other than demolition? And that would be residential development between 40 and 60 units.
We realized that the library project couldn't simply be diverted to this site, and that you would need to go through a whole other process to do that. And you're effectively in the queue based on the initial work that you've done for the library. The premise was that if, in effect, it fell through or you didn't make it through the grant process and you really needed a backup and there was significant support for doing some kind of library project, and that need, in effect, overwhelmed the town's sensibility about developing this parcel further, if there was a certain resentment to developing 40 units of housing on the site, the library project potentially fell through. It was as it was previously planned. Then you have a fallback development position to potentially develop the library here. That's why it's still on the table.
You mentioned building restrictions. Give us a little feedback on building restrictions. What do you feel that the restrictions are out there? You said that we placed restrictions on
land.
It was the utilization of the land that
okay, you mean the zoning utilization?
No, taking some land to develop the property.
Okay.
In the back.
I mean, that, right now the school uses that, as everybody knows, as a field hockey, but from what I understand, there's fields up at the elementary school that can be used. There's news fields that can be made over at the high school. So if it's going to make a difference to developing this area, then I think we need to look at that as a whole. Okay.
Well, that's what I think part of this is about today for you.
That's right.
To say, yes, let's proceed with like a 40-unit development, but we're going to need X amount of land. And is it okay to proceed with that?
We've already lost a fight to rent it out a long time ago,
right.
Okay, because of this whole mess, all right? And maybe it's time that we move forward, and the school is going to have to find another field hockey place to play.
And not only as the committee also, we were looking, when you keep saying the library, when I say library, we're trying to couple it with the Historical Society and maybe the basement or ground level. Let the rec department move in there where they could have outside facilities, bathrooms, but all coupled together, with the funding, if that's possible.
Okay, another question. Another question I have is housing for the elderly. Okay, if that was additional housing over there, and I noticed that you used some of the fields behind there and parking and so on. Is that something as an option that would work?
Well, we considered a bunch of different housing typologies, and Maura would probably be better qualified to speak to that, but we looked at some things that were very specific in their use, like whether or not veterans housing was a possibility, and what was the other group that we had talked about?
It was like people that have MS, or you have people that have special... Why we're having the meeting today was to talk about at 30,000 feet
Sure.
where you are, okay? If you're trying to get what's called a continuing care retirement community, which is a real full-service nursing home, they need a minimum of 120 units. You don't have it there. Even if you fully built out, I don't think the town would approve 120 units downtown. It's just not really simpatico with what you got going. But when we talked with several of the nonprofit developers, they would say, we need 40 units and we do a mixed use of market rate to some specialty subsidized housing so they could pull some federal or state grants in for that. And that's where you can be starting to become, we really need housing for people who work for the town of Hatfield. So we want housing for our young firemen, teachers, policemen who want to live in town, and we want to encourage it. So you can say we will allow X units to be subsidized housing, but you can also specify who that general group would be, like town employees. So you can make it a win-win situation if you're trying to go for 40 units, and I'll call that mixed-use housing because they would have several different buckets of people that could be tenants. It could be vets, it could be Hatfield senior citizens, it could be Hatfield employees, it could be a variety of things. But if the unanimous thought was no, 12 units, that's what you get, and maybe we'll give an acre of parking, that changes the dynamic. So we didn't want to go really deep into one silo until we got your feedback.
But you mentioned the 40 versus 60 unit for housing. What was the delta in the space required behind the building to support those?
Much land for 40 to 60.
I don't remember specifically.
Okay.
It's
an acre, I believe.
one of the developed scenarios. But obviously, it has a tangible impact on...
most of the line.
Yeah.
It took most of it? I see.
That's
40, so it's...
Okay.
Again, this is not proposing a layout, but it's just showing
I
the
understand.
area. 40, potentially, the field hockey could be maintained, but not the baseball, the Little League field.
That's all right.
And on 60 units, then the whole property has to be really developed.
So the 60 units would be just 41,000 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a two-story kind of structure. And if you go to the next slide, with the single, it's only, nope, keep going back. Yep, there you go. That's roughly 32,000, and that's also just including the existing building too.
For 8 units, yeah.
Okay.
If the property is developed for 40 units, then a portion of the playing field can indeed be maintained.
Theoretically, yes.
That's correct, yeah.
We keep the field hockey field, but lose the Little League.
Just field hockey.
You keep the field hockey.
And you would also keep the road so people walking around town could access the river. We hear that that's part of the
Yes.
culture of the town, is that loop is sacred land.
Sacred ground,
Yes,
yeah.
one of the things we discussed in the committee is keeping that possibly as a park, that open area, if the building is developed for housing.
You mean the remainder of the field?
To retain the back of it,
Yeah.
at least for a parking area where people would have access to the river. Presently, it is being used for walks to
Yes.
the river. A lot of people use it for exercise. And I think it's important because
Good.
it's the center of your town as such. And that site has some historical, value, I think, for the town. And if we can't keep the building, unless, I would hope that we'd be able to keep at least a portion of the site for the town. And one of the problems is the cost of remediation,
Yes.
the cost of construction of that building. I would like to see the building retained, frankly, in some manner. And I think the library is a potential means. I realize that the grant presently is tied to the present site, and I know people have worked very hard to see that come to fruition. But if it doesn't, the only way we can get public funds presently, I think, is through developing the property for library use. I think that's about the only municipal use right now that would probably be feasible. And that has to be considered, I think, by the town. If the town wants to retain that building, if the town doesn't want to retain the building, then housing is the optimum choice. But I think if we go that route, then I think it's important that we retain at least part of the playing field. And maybe the town doesn't want to sacrifice any portion of that, I don't know, or maybe they want to sacrifice it all. But I think it's important that that site, because it is the center of our town, be maintained in some fashion.
Well, I personally agree with you completely. So perhaps maybe the direction, let me just throw it out. Well, twofold. One, continuing on the housing with the 40 unit, which would retain the playing fields, it would retain access to the dike, and then as an alternative, or the other alternative would be to retain the issue of retaining it for public use in pursuing the library. If that's possible. And there's, I know the recreation folks have notions about how to build out the back, potential for the COA to
The other
share it.
usage we've discussed in the committee, and I think it's important, since this is being televised, that the public know that, is that whether or not that site could be developed as a senior center. I think the senior center here is probably too small, maybe presently, to meet the needs. I don't know. Either senior center combined with a community center and possibly housing. And Stanley has thought that that could be used as a combined senior community center and possibly housing in the basement. But I don't think it's feasible, quite frankly. It's just a question. But I think it's very important, since we're all here together, that the architect now, they want some direction from the town. They want to know where to go, and they need that badly. So it's important that you, the Board of Selectmen, as well as the members of the committee, give a vent to the direction. They need direction, and we haven't yet been able to give it our consensus on the committee. But I think they would really like some direction from the board as well as the committee.
I believe we all talked about having that as a library. If we continue to proceed with the library, then I feel it should go, 1, to town meeting, and 2, then put on a ballot and have both the town meeting vote on it and a ballot vote. That way you know that the town is going to be committed to put the library there. Because right now we have naturally a group of people that want the library down next to the library existing. All right? So if they're going to fight that and not this, then it's going to be a toss-up here. Okay, so I think you've got to get clear direction from the town. I mean, we have our opinions, but I think we need it from the townspeople on their opinion on what they really want to do. Do they want the library at the existing library, the addition, or do they want to turn this into a new library and clean up the center of town? Definitely something has to be done with it. We have to, as town officials, have to be careful on what money is spent in that building. We have infrastructures throughout the whole town that are failing, that need work before any buildings need work, okay? Because, God forbid, the sewer doesn't run, we're in trouble. Everybody's in trouble. The water doesn't run, that's in trouble. So there's some priorities that have to take place over some of the buildings, and that's some of the reasons why we have to be careful on where we spend some money here. Even though we'd love to spend more money, but we can't in some cases.
I'm sorry.
One of the things with retaining, believe me, I'm not for taking away the field hockey field because, my grandchildren play field hockey, and I don't want people calling me going, oh my God, you're against the field hockey field. But going down there to the games right now, as the building stands and the parking is, if you retain the field hockey field there, and you're going to talk about potentially building a 40-unit housing, the parking will be an issue because people that come to the games park on Main Street, plus they park behind, and if that building is going to be utilized for housing, then that parking area for the housing is going to be totally shut off to people parking for the games. So our committee did speak about the possibility of another place for the field hockey, for the school and the town to think about building another field hockey field, because I think the fields back there would really benefit the building up front. You have more potential of putting a park in and parking spaces for people that want to go on the dike and type way in the back and still retain, if you're going to do housing, parking spaces just for the housing without parking on Main Street.
If it's not a field hockey use, you have more flexibility in laying out
Exactly.
the public use of the space.
Exactly.
Whether it's
And
relocating
believe me,
the pavilion
I'm not against taking, I'm not for taking the field away. I know how much, it means to the town and to the school and stuff, but if there is another spot that we could build a field hockey field, I think, that might be something we should consider.
One of the things that I just mentioned, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
was, I looked down my numbers, the taxes, if you did the 40 units, were anticipated to be about $133,000 a year. And that is, again, before you give any kind of incentive, but that's money you don't have. And there's been a consistency that Paul has driven home to the committee of what good stewards of the money that you have and how you spend it, and that there isn't a lot of money to go around for any of the projects you need. So keep your eye on the ball in that you could in fact be getting a project going back on the tax rolls.
Okay, the other side of that is if it's elderly, 55 and older, that's one thing. But if it's just open housing for everybody, and you've got 2 kids per unit or 1 kid per unit at $10,000 a unit, that's a lot of money taken away. So the $150,000 all of a sudden diminishes because now you've got to educate all those kids, and it costs a burden on your town. You have to be really careful on that part.
We have capacity in our school system.
It doesn't matter on capacity. It matters on how much money the town will have to spend to educate the kids.
Again, this goes back to if you decide you want us to look at the 40 units, there's a program called the Rutgers University Study that shows, depending on the size of the unit and how much the rent, how many children will go into the school system. So you can divide things that are studio apartments or 1.5 bedroom, meant for den. Those have very few young people in the school system, as opposed to saying you're putting up a 3-bedroom apartment, which is going to lend to more kids. So you can control a bit of that through how, when you write the criteria for the developer, saying this is the market we want you to appeal to, and this is basically, you're not trying to micromanage them, going back to my initial statement, the market will tell you, but there are ways of quantifying, which we'll be glad to do.
And we're not, I'm sorry, we're not looking for necessarily a specific recommendation from you. We realize that it's effectively a town decision, but if there is something that you can impart to us about the work that we have done so far that directs us in a way, for example, that as you said, Mr. Lesko, the open space consideration, the maintenance of the fields, that needs to come into play, in the course of the project, we feel that there is a significant amount of open space in the town of Hatfield, and that, in all likelihood, there would be another location where you could have these sports activities. As we were talking about the initial development of the project, Jeannot, Patrick, and Maura and I were looking at what goes on in the town. We looked at how segmented the town is in terms of its uses from a zoning perspective. We looked at the fact that, people walk this loop within town, and we were considering, as we were postulating what we might do with the parcel, what uses we could put on the site that would really make the site more of a community function. And so the idea that you have this connection to the river, that people walk around town and they could effectively walk through this site and go to the river, and it could be something more grand. We liked that idea. It seemed a bit beyond what the real function of the study was to go so far with a solution, and there were so many other things really to evaluate. But those are the kinds of things that we're really looking for you to say to us. Either there is a narrowing of focus or something along those lines.
Well, as I said earlier, there are trades required. And clearly, if you look at what are we talking about, what's the goal here? And the goal is to find an acceptable use of the property here in the center of town. Now, there's some trades required in sorting through that. And there are alternatives to the playing fields. I'll just throw on the table, just as a way ahead, if you're looking for some direction, and my colleagues can jump in or agree or disagree, but a twofold strategy. One, with the housing, and use the 40 unit or so, and plan to use some of the playing field, retain the entry to the dike area for walking and exercise purposes. The remainder, if it's sufficient for the field hockey, fine. If not, as Ms. Parada suggested, at least it's a park kind of area, open.
Not just a potential.
For community, yeah, I know, we're not trying to define it, but...
I would like to see the building retained in some
and then, well,
because you have to think about the growth of this town. You have to think not only about today, but tomorrow. And I think it's the center of your town.
Yep.
And it's very important that that building and that site be maintained, that realistically it may no longer be feasible for this town because of the need for sewer and water problems that we have that will need remediation.
Then the second look would be to continue to look at the public use with the school being, the library being the driver, and we have to sort that out here shortly, but the library, recreation, potentially council on aging, those kinds of uses.
I got a couple questions. As far as the library, I do remember going to the committee 5 years ago, probably 6 years ago, and they definitely didn't want anything to do with that building. Absolutely nothing to do with that building.
Okay.
Now we went to town meeting 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, appropriated money for an engineering study, an architectural study of the existing library, which again costs the taxpayers a lot of money. I can't come up with a total figure, but it's up there. Now for me to go back to town floor and tell people, no, we don't want that building, we'll throw that money away, let's design something over here, I don't think that's going to fly. It wouldn't fly with me. I personally like the idea of the 40 units for elderly, number one. That's always been my choice. And for veterans. We've got veterans out there right now that are homeless. And I think we could possibly get some government money to help us renovate that place and to add on in the back. That is my feeling, and I just, as far as the library goes, and I agree with Ms. Parada, but On the other hand, I don't want to see this money thrown away that we've already appropriated, you know. That is my personal feeling, so that's it.
My feeling on the land itself, the building is a beautiful building, but to me, the land is most valuable to the town for future. And I'm not talking about our future, I'm talking about our kids' future, okay? If we do anything with it, I feel it should be a leasehold property, okay, instead of a fee simple. And I don't know how you guys have presented this, but to me, the leasehold would be give them a 100-year lease, give them a 200-year lease. At least down the road, our future kids can decide what to do with it instead of our deciding what to do with it right now. At least there's a say down the road when the lease comes to an end. And I would recommend a 100-year lease. None of us will be around, and let the kids decide what they want to do at that point in time.
I have a couple of questions. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the options that we talked about initially was, you know, renovating strictly the building for housing. But because of the economics, that's simply not an option. Is that correct?
It appears, like I say, the gentleman who said, I'll buy it for $1, and I
Hadn't seen the report.
You know, hasn't seen the report.
Yeah.
Maybe he's done this 12 times, and each time he's made it work.
Yeah.
But that gets into the balance of, he said, I will buy it, not lease it. Other people have said, I have no problem doing a 50-year lease if you do the environmental remediation. So my mini recommendation is, now that we have an idea of how much the environmental is, you shouldn't wait 3 months to have us finish the report. Paul should be commissioned, aren't you glad I'm volunteering you?
Thank you.
To be, you know, talking with Jim about what state funds are available for doing the environmental remediation. That shouldn't wait, because developers don't like environmental remediation. It's just a black hole. They want it to be delivered clean. They can take care of the shell and the ADA when it's their turn to be the developer. Environmental people kind of just shy away from.
Are you referring the setback away from the river as a 100-foot buffer, anything closer to that? Or is that what you're referring to, environmental, or
No.
the environmental?
I'm talking about
Asbestos and lead paint.
Building is
All the structural
asbestos and lead paint.
Asbestos pipe insulation,
Tiles.
vinyl asbestos tile.
Yeah.
Paint.
The potential for an oil tank still potentially be under the slab, and also the pigeon and other
I mean,
fecal matter in the
that's
the
not
attic
something
and
we can say, let it go. It's something the state
Right.
is basically going to have to say, you know, I mean, they've got guidelines on what has to happen now.
Yep.
And they can't say to the developer, well, we're going to give you special privileges over here and then attack everybody else.
Absolutely,
you can't do that.
That's what I'm saying, is that now that HAI and the engineers have come up with a pretty good laundry list of what has to be covered, you shouldn't wait for the report to be finished before you start addressing, are there funds available to take care of that remediation? It would just make it a lot easier when you go out to the development community.
And the cost of remediation is $75,000 or $100,000, you think?
It's more like $120,000. The $73,000 or $74,000 was just for the lead paint. When you add the asbestos pipe insulation and the vinyl asbestos tile, it's closer to $120,000.
Okay, fine,
Plus a few other
lovely things.
items that I mentioned.
Unless this is an outright grant to the town, it's going to be hard sell on the town side to spend $120,000 on that building to remove the lead paint when we've got to put a sewer line in on King Street because it's failed, and you got to spend $250,000 there. Okay, so the difference between the two, you have to be really careful here.
My next question.
Yes.
Let's talk about the 40 units. Is that economically viable as a standalone, or is there going to need to be some kind of government subsidy coming from someplace?
There will, and at this point, and I just got the numbers from the gentleman yesterday, that it looked like it needed some kind of tax incentive or some other nudge from you folks to make it happen.
Okay.
And that included having the rent be zero for it. You know, the rent would be your taxes, if you will. So I did not put anything in for a rental payment on an annual basis. That's the kind of stuff we get in and we fine-tune once we decide which way you want to go.
Okay.
So I'll be running a lot more numbers based on 40 units, and I'll go back to the development community. And I never put it, they want to sell, they want to lease. You
Right.
said, under what terms would you take it? Would you consider a long-term lease? Would you insist on fee ownership? One person was adamant about having to own it in fee. The rest said, depending on the other terms and conditions, we could get financing for a 50-year lease.
In this impact study that you're referring to, I would like to see that it includes anything to do with the school,
Right.
children, so
Yep.
on. Okay, you can
Noted.
say that it's going to impact our taxes, we're going to make money, $150,000, but how much is it going to cost us on the other end when you educate X amount of kids?
Okay,
Okay?
done, or will be done.
So my final comment, I guess, question, if it's the town's decision to salvage the building, it sounds to me like, at a minimum, the baseball field is going to have to be part of the package.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
to summarize, yes.
That's what I'm trying to do.
I'm sorry, say that again, please?
That if it's the town's decision to salvage try and save the building, the baseball field is basically going to have to be sacrificed.
Okay, but
Relocated.
I'm not sure how much that's even being used. Did you explore that at all? I think they're planning at the elementary school now,
Yes.
Yeah, I spoke to the
They
rec
moved.
committee chairman, and he mentioned that...
so it's really just the
So it's not
field
even-
hockey.
It's not, so the baseball field isn't being used
It's
now?
overgrown right now.
It's
and,
right.
Okay.
That's
They're-
not an
Okay.
I believe
They've invested behind the elementary school.
Makes sense.
the rec committee chairman mentioned that they are already exploring another...
But just to
Option two.
clarify, let's clarify this. In other words, you talk about the baseball field.
Baseball.
But you could still retain an area where the field hockey.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. We're talking about the area right...
Optimum way would be to go to a ground lease, quite frankly, but I
Correct.
don't know whether or not a developer can be found that would be willing to take that, a ground lease for the building and the baseball field, and still leave part. But that's something
Yeah.
to be explored as such.
So my mission is, between now and the next time we meet, to look further at the 40-unit development along with the HAI team. I'll look at the impact of schools. I'll find out more about fee versus long-term lease. Any other specific questions?
fee simple or leasehold.
Right.
Okay? I, for
Federal
one,
grants.
if it were going to be a fee simple, which is be they'd own it outright, I'd be standing up at town meeting floor against it. Okay?
I'll just give you the
I'm
information.
just letting you
and then
know
can-
that leasehold is very important.
Just to clarify for you, if it's a lease, the town retains the fee,
Right.
which is the ownership of
Right.
the property.
Right.
So you are, is renting out for
Correct.
a
As long as it's rented out,
Correct.
absolutely, I have no problem with it.
I just have one other
Yes.
question. Have you met with the housing authority and talked to them at all?
No.
Okay, because we do have Capital
Correct.
One over here, and you're on the housing authority. Do you need more units?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
We have no two-bedroom units.
I will be glad to do that again. We were trying to be up here and not go
Understand.
deep until we got some feedback as to, exactly what you were trying to do. Or not exactly, but direction as to A or B. But now we'll go deep and look at housing, including vets, seniors.
Okay.
How about town employees? Is there a need for town employee housing?
I don't really think so. I mean, there may be somewhere down the line, but right now I think we're pretty well
We'd be
set
more
with it.
concerned about our elderly than our town employees at this point in time.
Okay.
The housing authority is a good place to start to have a meeting with them.
I will do that.
All right.
And Buster, I'll get your phone number so I can call.
Anything else? This subtopic?
Good.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone, to the June 25th meeting. Tonight, we'll be talking about the Center School Site Assessment Reuse Advisory Group presentation, our final presentation and a report. And from there, we'll turn it over to consultants to discuss what's going on here with the center school, and we'll move right into the meeting, and if there's any questions and so on, we'll move on with the meeting. So. Thank you. Thank you for making this special meeting so that we can present the project and so that we could accommodate as much of the committee as possible to be here. I know everyone has a real interest in getting this project to be successful and to make something really special for the town. The purpose of today's meeting is to provide the final report. We have binders and CDs, digital copies. But we also want to just review the content that's in it, just in an overview. We went through in a lot of detail last time, and essentially the report has been tweaked and updated, but the substantial content is the same, except for the development scenarios, which we'll get to in a minute, of the actual residential development that we've proceeded with, the development scenarios, and also to provide an update from Maura on her marketing data and basically how where we go from here to proceed with the project so that the town can actually make this happen. So started again, just the contents of the report itself. There's an overview. We've inserted floor plans this time of the existing buildings, so someone can get a sense of the existing conditions, a little more detail in addition to all the photos that we have within the project report. There's the overview that we reviewed in more detail last time of the building envelope, the structure, the mechanical systems, the infrastructure, necessary improvements in order to stabilize the building and to make it useful for any basic use. There's the marketing analysis assessment, and then the development scenarios in section D that we're going to get to. There's also a lot of backup material in the appendix primarily for the marketing assessment, but we've also inserted the soil boring test results that we received from the tests that were performed just Saturday on the south side of the building. And there were no surprises, and it shouldn't have a negative effect on the project. So here's some of the floor plans that we included. And then I'll get to the development scenarios. So, okay, we have the information divided into two main categories. One is kind of an overview of the site development, and both in the building itself and the back area for the different units that would be developed, as well as the open space that would be provided. And then there's also a section on specific unit layouts within the building and in the additional areas. I want to emphasize that what we're showing here is more of a feasibility of that it can be accomplished. That there's really a million answers to designing how the units could be laid out, but this is showing that it's feasible and that it could be done. This is site scheme A. We have scheme A and scheme B. Essentially, there's 8 to 10 units within the main building itself, ranging, as you'll see, anywhere from 1-bedroom units up to 3-bedroom, depending on the mix that you'd like to have. And then there's clusters of units in this particular scenario in which we have groups of 4 units. So there's you see there's 2 shapes that are combined together. There's 2 floors in each, so that there'd be 2 ground level units and 2 second floor units. So there's 4 units within each of 8 different clusters. In this scenario, they're spread out a little bit more, and the parking is a little bit more spread out, and then you have a more contiguous open space on the back. There's about 2.5 acres of open space in the back that would be retained for public use. In the second scenario, we tried to see if it was possible to maximize the amount of open space. We didn't really achieve too much more. It extends farther into the back area, but provides more space along the access road. But it requires the grouping of the units as opposed to a more spread out layout, and groups the parking also into larger areas. We end up with about 2.8 versus 2.5 acres of open space. But there is space all along the access road. And then within the building itself, in the center school, the option one, we have 3 different options. This, again, there's, really an infinite number of options. This retains the existing corridor and stair structure within the building so that it has probably the least amount of impact of any of the scenarios that we're showing. There's 4 one-bedroom units on the first floor, common spaces within those extra spaces that are on the street side. The views are out to the back and across to the river. All the access is from that main existing corridor, though we did reduce the width of it in order to add additional storage space and entries. The second floor is essentially the same layout. Again, 4 one-bedroom units, so you end up with 8 one-bedroom units in this option 1 plan. And option 2, it's essentially the same. The units are a little bit smaller because there were additional staircases inserted in order to take a different approach on the second floor. As you'll see here, it eliminates the whole circulation corridor so that the extra stairs provide access, and you have the option for larger units, anywhere from 2 to 3 bedroom units. So you have really a large variety of options of unit mix. And we only explored from 1 to 3 bedroom. We didn't explore how many studio apartments you can get into the building.
Is there an elevator there?
There is not an elevator here. The approach we took is that you could have access to the first floor if you provide a ramp to the main entrance, and also that all of the first floor units throughout the rest of the site would all be accessible. But obviously that would be an option to add. We have costs shown if someone wanted to take that approach. The third option is similar to the second in that you have 4 one-bedroom units with the extra stairs. And on the upper level, you have, instead of 3 or 4 larger units, you have up to 6 units. So you could have 10 units within the building. There's 4 one-bedroom units, 2 on each end, and then a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom in the center. And the units go across so that you have views from both sides of the building. Are there any questions on the site layouts or just showing the feasibility that it is possible? If not, I'll turn it over to Maura to provide an update on her material. I'll get this back to her section.
Is the basement to be storage?
The mechanical storage for the units above, yeah.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Maura Cochran from Barchman Cochran. Is this on? Is that working for you? Okay. I'm going to concentrate tonight on talking about your next steps rather than going back as to how we got to the point, because I believe last time your group came to the conclusion that you wanted to pursue option A for about 40 units. In our report, we do make the recommendation that you sell or enter into a long-term land lease for 3.8 acres to a developer, to be chosen through the RFP, RFQ process, qualifications first, then a proposal. The reason that we're saying it can be one or the other is that when we interviewed regional developers, some liked the idea of a long-term land lease. That really brought their initial investment down because they didn't have to buy the land. As an owner, a long-term land lease makes sense because you can, in fact, make money on the land several times over. Given the amount of infrastructure that anyone's going to have to put in, you'd be looking at a minimum of 30 years, probably a 40-year lease term. So in rough terms, probably every 12 to 15 years, you'd be getting money back, money back, money back. It's always a good thing. The RFQ should stipulate what you're looking for, and this really gets into one of your major action steps, is that you have to be as specific as possible as to what you're trying to achieve, because developers really dislike uncertainty. So if you're saying in the RFQ that Hatfield is going to permit 40 units plus or minus for this project, you really can't hamper the developers, and all the work that's been done by HII is just wonderful, but someone may come in and say, oh, we want to put in all efficiency units here, we want larger units in the back. The market's going to determine that. But you have to say, we want you to convert the center school to multifamily purposes. We want you to permit X number of units for a total of 40, so they get to choose how big, how large, and where they would be on the site. You can ask them in the RFQ portion, do you have a preference for owning outright or a land lease? You ask them, what kind of a development would you like to see here? If there are any pet projects that the town really wants, for instance, in the interviews, one group wanted to have a community room included. Now is the time to ask. If you're looking, from your perspective, what you're really trying to do is get tax revenues in. So this is going to be a good thing. You want it to go on the tax rolls as soon as you can. But in any case, during the RFQ process, you're going to be spreading the widest net possible and getting more people in. The RFQ also should stipulate a conservation easement for the remaining acreage. Again, a decision that your team and town will make a decision on. Are you selling, conveying all of the acreage, or just the 3.8? We can lead you, we can just say that is a discussion. If you convey the entire thing, then the part of the developer will be in charge of maintaining the property, which may be a good thing for you. You may prefer to have them be responsible for weeding and snow removal and access, or you may say, no, we want to retain that as a town park. It's your call, and there's no right answer to that, your decision. But you have to be precise in that. Another major point is that now that HAI has gone and done a lot of work as to figuring out the cost of the environmental cleanup, to the extent that the state, oh, good morning, the state or feds or anyone else can provide money to clean up the environmental, do it now while you're setting up the RFQ process. I think it was, what, $120,000 for environmental? I didn't memorize. Sounds about right. For the abatement. Yeah, for the abatement. So say it's $120,000, and you tell, in the question in the RFQ, you'll be saying, will you take the building as is, or are you going to mandate that it be cleaned up? Some developers will just say, we'll take it as is, and that might be a very good way for you to go. But I will tell you that developers hate uncertainty. Underline it again. If we think it's 120, they're going to be putting it in for 180, 200,000, because until you get into it, you just don't know. So to the extent that you can convey to the developer a clean property, the better off you'll be. And I'm saying that if for some reason you can't find any other funds to clean it up, you're going to be getting money in from tax dollars. Talk to your bonding advisor and see if it's better for you to take the loan out for $120,000. That's going to be paid off by the increase in taxes rather than conveying it with the other side paying for it. So that's a big open issue. Who's going to pay for it, and what is your bonding capability given the fact that you would have new taxes? I am not advising, and you don't need to pay for it on the come, saying we'll clean it up now and hope we get someone. It could be a simultaneous thing. You're finding a developer, closing with them, then you know you've got a deal, and then you know you've got the money to pay for the cleanup. A second. Walk, talk, chew gum. Can you put up this page, please? It is the marketing assessment options. That one. And the only really important thing here is how much money would you be getting for these different options. This is based on your current mill rate. If you only did the center school building, nothing else, we anticipated, based on the building costing $4.466 million, the annual taxes would be, property taxes would be around $56.6. If, in fact, the new development would come in at $12.3 million, the annual taxes would be $156,000, give or take. And that's a good amount of money. That allows you to pay fairly quickly for the remediation that needs to take place. Okay, you can take that off again. Just wanted, I knew I couldn't memorize those numbers. I'd get those wrong.
Those numbers that you were talking about, okay, the 156, if we finish with the development, is this going to be open market for all income housing instead of just elderly, or is this?
That is just saying that you have a property. You want to turn the lights on? Yep. If you have a property that costs $12 million to develop, and it is a market property, you take that, divide it by $1,000 and multiply it by 12.67, and that's how you get to what the taxes would be. Now, you can talk to people, and you can, one of the things that is in my scope of work, I'm not trying to jump ahead, is I had to do a pro forma, because you have to say, well, if it costs $13 million, $12 million to build this, are the rents around here adequate enough to cover that kind of construction? And the answer is maybe. Because financing right now is really squirrely. I'm on the board of the Hartford Y, and we're redoing our bonds, and we're getting 20-year bonds at like 2.3%. I'm working with another developer who wants a forward commitment, and he's at 6.7%. So you go to a spreadsheet and you go, well, are you going to be dealing with someone who is going to be able to get really low interest money for a fairly long period of time or not? So what I'm advising on the spreadsheet is that if our job here is done, I'll be glad to transmit it to Paul, anyone else who wants it. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And when different developers come in and say, oh, we can't afford this, we need a tax break, it's a very simple pro forma. Mm-hmm. We can just plug in the numbers and see if they have a deficit or not.
And my point with the numbers is that if you have children coming in there, for 10 children, that's $100,000 in our school system to educate them. 15 kids, that's $150,000. That wiped out your total taxes, okay, with 15 kids.
This is true.
Okay, so if you're going to go one step, you better go the whole, let everybody know what the outcome or the flip side of that is also.
That goes back to, again, writing your RFP as to who and what you want in there. Sure. There is at one point a discussion of people saying, well, we want to encourage young professionals to come in. Another group says we have seniors who want to sell the farm. You know, they don't want a large property, but they want to remain in Hatfield. We have other people who are saying they're being priced out of Northampton, whether they have children or not. You can design it, the more bedrooms you have, oddly enough, the more children you could anticipate. That's right. So you, through the design process, through the RFP, can say, we want to have a concentration of units that are X, Y, and Z. Or you can say to the developers, we are interested in groups that are going to be coming in, servicing the people who are over 55, or whichever way you want to look at it. Again, our marketing report was just to say, what is the market? It wasn't for office, hotel, it wasn't for X. It is for housing. You have some decisions you have to make, and we're here to help you try to make those decisions.
I just didn't want to have everybody think that it's a big moneymaker when it's really, when you really put the numbers down on what the expenses are, it's not a big moneymaker.
Well, you have to also consider we have excess capacity in our school system now.
Sure. The capacity is not the problem.
Okay.
Okay, when she's going by a specific $150,000, $156,000 in taxes for the year, and if you're going to spend $150 just to educate 14 kids, the tax money is wiped right out. There's no...
We'll debate it later.
Yeah. So,
Topic for another day.
Yes. The action steps, I've been sort of discussing the marketing strategy of write a very well-written RFQ rather than an RFP. Developers, especially good ones, will not respond much anymore to RFPs. They have to spend serious money to get all the documentation in. They feel like they're being played one against the other. They don't go for it. But in the RFQ, you're asking them, give us your qualifications, give us your references, give us your idea of what you would like to see accomplished there. And you can ask the question of land lease versus outright fee ownership. You can ask the question of as is. And people are more than glad to answer these questions. Because at that point, and you can talk to your purchasing department as to how you want to do it, if you absolutely find the right person, that may qualify enough as a public offering. Or you may, in fact, need to do the more formal RFP. You can just ask your purchasing department. As you know, you make the decision, and today's Wednesday, and Paul was at his desk Thursday morning saying, okay, now what do I do? You're going to do a couple of things right off. One is you're going to create a database. The interviews that are listed here are an excellent place to start. We have developers that we've interviewed. We've given you their names and their company names. You know the major commercial brokers. If not, they're easy to come by. The major residential brokers. The people who run Massachusetts Housing, the Home Builders Union, whatever. Create a big database. At the same time, you're going to be creating a PR campaign. This is being filmed. Get something out that you're trying to convert the school. Anyone has a question, call Paul or call someone on the committee, but get the word out and set up a good PR campaign. So, any questions on what Paul's doing tomorrow morning? Going through, you have to define in the RFP, as you're writing it, the land to be conveyed, because we had two plans here, sort of an A1 and A2, as to whether it was a straight across or a dog leg. You may want to consider which of those two plans you want. The density, we've come up with 40 acres. Is it going to be plus or minus 40 acres? But tell them what it would be. You'll need to know what the property value is. And you need an appraisal to do that. The appraisal will be for what is the value of this property if it is properly zoned for 40 units. You're not looking for what is the value of the center school. In my humble opinion, this school has a negative value. You're not saying what is the value of unzoned land. That is not the question. What is the value of what you have with the entitlements in place? And I'm sure you know some good appraisers. If not, I can provide some names. We talked before purchase versus land lease. We talked about remediation. And talk about any restrictions that you want as to the type and use of people or any special interests that you have. I think one meeting or so ago I asked, is there any housing need for people who work in the town of Hatfield, whether they're educators or police force? You can have a priority list for people like that. Again, your call. We also mentioned the community room. Funding. I think you're going to be close friends with Jim in the back row there talking about what funding can be helped. And I gave you about 3 pages of different state and federal places that one can go for remediation. So all of that should lead to a very positive amount of energy, telling people, here we are, this is what you've got, because it will remove a lot of the uncertainty, but you have some homework to do before you get to that step. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
It's been a lot of fun. I've had some very good food in your town, too.
Okay, I'll let you go next. So where do we go from here?
Just got the,
I mean, do you have any more to present? Okay.
No, that's
That's
the
basically
conclusion of our
everything in a nutshell. So we've got our homework to do. We've got to go and review all the stuff and where we want to go and what we want to do here. And
We're available to assist you.
yeah, that was my question. Where are we now with the contractor support? You delivered the
in
report.
terms of the contract,
Right.
you know, we will have completed everything by virtue of handing this material to you, and that's the extent of our contractual involvement. But if you need us to do other things, you can certainly contact us, and you know, we will help you or try to figure out what it is that you need and identify what cost might be associated with that in order that you can take advantage of our services.
okay, I'd like to get a little input from the committee and find out what the committee thinks and feels. I don't know who the spokesperson wants to be, Bob?
I would like to talk. Bob Bartlett, I'm on the school reuse committee. Our chairman, John Wolf, couldn't make it. You saw the presentation. The marketing folks said that housing is the way to go. The architect did some perspective layouts, what could be done. But the developer, what we'd like to see is the developer bring some ideas to the town. Once you get done with either the RFP or the RFQ, they'll know how they want to market it or what would best fit their marketing plan. Of course, I guess we'd have to go to town meeting in order to sell the property.
Right, we do.
And that's what our committee's work and our consultants' work. It all boils down to the town needs to sell that building because we can't afford to own it. And in a few years, it's going to be knocked down if it doesn't get developed because the building is deteriorating there. It's just falling apart just from lack of use. So the ball is kind of in your court now. I think the consultants have done their job. Our committee, we've done our job. We presented you with us, meaning the consultants and the committee, presented you with the recommendations, and now the selectmen have to decide the next step, which would be to
Put all the facts together and bring it before town meeting and
before
figure out
town
what we're
meeting.
going
If
to do.
that's what you folks agree, think is the best thing would be to sell the property, bring it to town meeting to get permission to sell it, and then do the RFQ, RFP to get a developer in here to get that taken care of.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Yes.
Just clarifications in the back of some stuff Bob talked about. The committee did, you had issued you a memo and it's outlined from, signed by the members. They had a couple meetings that discussed the consultants' reports and findings and feedback, and then internally. And one of the rationales is the committee went back and forth on either ownership or a lease. And I think based upon the memo, there was consensus that we'd rather see a sale of the property with very tight restrictions on the building, whether on the use, on the units, on the historical considerations, on the open space in the back. One of the bases of that and is under Mass General Law, Chapter 40, Section, I think it's 3 or 5. I believe the maximum number of years you could lease the property is 30 years, and they felt that would be a disadvantageous position in order to limit to 30 years, and had more of a response from developers from a longer term, i.e. for sale. The other, and I'm not positive, but I don't believe you can do RFQ for disposition of public property under Chapter 30B. I think it's only RFP or IFB, but that's just a confirmation on that.
Thank you.
But again, the committee, they based their decision on recommendation to you actually on those considerations. And also, they felt that they didn't want to see the town take on more cost on the Plain property. Basically, if you're looking at a $12 million project, that's 1% of the construction cost, that's negligible, and that there aren't a lot of monies out there to do cleanup. There is some brownfields money, but if you're the owner, you were technically the cause of it, which, you know, you had it for all the years, so you're not eligible for any cleanup money. So why the committee felt, why take on more debt for something that we don't know if it's going to be developed, so it's only $120,000, come on, it's a $12 million project, the developer can absorb that cost. And let them do their due diligence and inspections and so on and so forth. But, you know, they pretty much outlined their recommendations in a little two-pager, and it is consistent with, you know, a couple of small little deviations and turns with the good work that these folks did. So, you know, that will give you pretty much what they came up with.
Yes, Marna.
One thought, we're helping another municipality, in Hartford actually, and we're doing an adaptive reuse of a campus, and the city is very concerned about the density that the developer wants. So what is being proposed is a floating zone. So when you talk to your land use attorney about this, talk about a floating zone that has the following characteristics. I mean, it has to be 5 acres. It can be no more than an FAR, a density of X. You know, it has to front the Connecticut River. It can be enough that is so specific that someone can't come in a few years, go for the same density where you don't want it, and claim you did it here, you've got to do it there. So just look at the floating zone as a solution. I'm not saying it's perfect for you, but you want to think ahead of what will come if you allow the density to go here.
Thank you. Brian, any questions?
I do not, thank you.
Yep.
I need to read the report.
I'd like to thank everybody for doing a wonderful job, the committee, the advisory committee for putting this all together and coming up with...
I do think that John wants to have a meeting, one more meeting.
Yes, I believe so.
Us with you guys.
We will have that. Once we review everything,
right.
Yeah, we'll call another meeting and discuss it amongst all of us. Okay. But for now, I just want to thank everyone for doing a wonderful job and the consultants for doing an excellent job. And
Thank you.
so we thank you very much. Okay.
Thank
Going
you.
back to the ground.
Okay.